Snow has its own way of moving out here. It doesn't fall straight like the picture book kind. It wanders. It drifts in slow, sideways arcs, curling over the ridge of a fence post, gathering in the crooks of cottonwood branches, settling quiet into the folds of the hills until the whole country looks like it's breathing under a pale quilt. Out here, winter doesn't arrive. It settles into you, slow and deep, until you forget the weight you're carrying isn't your own bones. I was mending a busted latch on the barn door when I saw them, two shapes moving out of the haze. They came small at first, shadows wrapped in frost, and my first thought was that I'd taken too much coffee and not enough sleep. Ghosts in the snow are easy enough to believe in when you've spent too many winters alone. But the longer I looked, the more I saw the sway of their steps, the way their shoulders bent forward as if leaning into an invisible rope, pulling themselves toward me. No one crossed my land in weather like this. No one sane anyway. They came on, heads bowed against the wind, skirts torn and stiff at the hems. The older one, older by her stance, not by the skin of her face, walked ahead with a careful eye, scanning every corner of the yard the way a hunter watches for the shift of a deer's ear. Behind her trailed the younger, near pressed to her sister's back, hands clutching a worn blanket pulled close to her throat. I didn't call out. Folks who show up in a snowstorm without a horse aren't usually looking for talk. I just swung the barn door wide and stepped aside. The smell of hay and leather rolled out with the heat from the little stove in the corner. They stepped in like animals testing new ground, eyes adjusting to the dim. I poured coffee from the pot into 2 dented tin cups and set them on the table. The older woman's gaze touched mine just long enough to measure something, sharp and quick, before she took hers. The younger nodded once, the smallest movement, like a bird dipping its head before flight, before wrapping her hands around the cup. They said nothing at first. I didn't push. The fire in the stove hissed as melting snow slid from their boots and skirts, pooling on the planks. When the silence had stretched long enough to feel heavy, I offered my name. Elias Boone. My voice felt loud in that space. The older woman spoke after a beat. Nayeli. She gestured toward her sister. Tallulah. The way she spoke their names made them feel like something precious that might be stolen. I nodded once, letting the rest stay theirs. That night the wind climbed up the walls, shaking loose bits of snow from the roof. I gave them the space by the stove and climbed to the loft, bedding down under an old horse blanket. The smell of wood smoke drifted up, but what kept me awake was the memory of Nayeli's eyes, clear, unflinching, the eyes of someone who's had to measure a man before deciding whether he's worth breathing near. Morning brought deeper snow. I could tell by the way the light bent through the cracks in the boards before I even stepped outside. The air was hard enough to cut, and I knew it would be days before the drifts would let anyone move far. They were stuck here. I was stuck with them. I kept to chores, splitting wood, checking the cattle shelter. When I came back in, Tallulah had left a cup of coffee beside my tools. She didn't speak, didn't look at me, just went back to stitching the tear in her shawl with thread the same color as smoke. That night, I set their moccasins on the workbench and mended the seams while the lamp hissed. We didn't talk about these trades. They just happened, quiet gestures sliding back and forth like cards on a table no one's watching. The days pressed in. Sometimes they spoke to each other in Apache, low and quick. I caught scraps of meaning, danger, father, safe, but not enough to weave the thread together. Nayeli would catch me listening, and her eyes would tell me the story wasn't mine to know. On the third morning, the sound of hooves cracked through the muffled air. I stepped out, rifle resting in the crook of my arm. A tall man sat his horse just beyond the yard, wrapped in a deerskin coat, hair in long braids tipped with strips of red cloth. His face was the color of the high desert and carved with years. When he swung down, snow slid from him in sheets. "You are Boone," he said, his English shaped by the cadence of another tongue. It was not a question. "I am," I said. "My daughters tell me you gave them shelter." He glanced toward the barn, where Nayeli and Tallulah stood framed in the doorway, their faces like carved stone. In such a storm, that is no small thing. He stepped closer, his eyes steady. "I am Chikawa. It is our way that a man who saves a woman's life must protect her name. You saved 2. You must take them both as wives." The words landed heavy, as if the snow itself had weight enough to press them into my chest. My fingers tightened on the rifle stock, not in anger but in the startled way a man steadies himself when the ground shifts. "I didn't do it for her." I stopped. His gaze didn't shift, didn't bend. Behind him, Nayeli met my eyes for the first time without that layer of guard. Tallulah looked down, her fingers curling tighter in her blanket. The wind moved between us, lifting powder from the drifts in thin silver ribbons. Somewhere inside, the part of me that had stayed untouched for years whispered to walk away, keep the life I knew, quiet, predictable, safe. But another part, the one I'd stopped trusting, thought about the sound of their voices in the barn, the taste of coffee handed to me without a word, the stitch in my coat mended without being asked. "I'll give you till tomorrow," Chikawa said. Then he turned and mounted, riding into the white until the storm swallowed him. That night the fire burned low. The only sounds were the shift of the logs and the wind pushing at the walls. I lay in the loft, staring at the beams, thinking of all the winters I'd spent in silence and what it would mean to break it. Below, I could hear them breathing, steady and even, as if the storm had finally let them rest. When morning came, the sky was clear, the air sharp enough to taste. Sunlight struck the snow until it burned the eyes. I stood outside, boots sinking deep, and waited. Chikawa appeared small at first, a moving shadow against the white, growing larger with each heartbeat. When he stopped before me, I didn't look away. "I'll do it," I said. Nayeli stepped forward, chin high, and for the first time her gaze didn't hold me at arm's length. Tallulah's shoulders loosened, her grip on the blanket slackening. The snow between us glittered under the sun, and for a moment it felt like the whole land was holding still. I didn't know what marriage to two strangers meant. I didn't know if this was a bond or a bargain. But I knew the storm had brought them to my door, and I wouldn't be the one to send them back into it. That first day after the agreement, the air between us felt different, quieter, heavier. Not uncomfortable, just thick with the unspoken. Chikawa stayed only long enough to leave words with his daughters in their own tongue, then rode off. I caught the shape of a promise in Tallulah's smile as she watched him go, but Nayeli's face gave away nothing. We moved through chores together, awkward at first. I showed them the smokehouse, the water pump, the way the wind curled through the canyon and buried the east fence if you didn't keep it cleared. Nayeli listened, eyes following the lay of the land. Tallulah laughed once, light, surprising, when the pump handle splashed her. The sound startled me more than it should have, and she must have seen it because she looked quickly away. Nights grew easier. We ate together by the stove, not talking much but not needing to. Nayeli began to hum under her breath when she worked with her hands. Tallulah asked once for a piece of my whittling wood, then carved a small bird and set it on the windowsill without a word. It was in these quiet things, the easy back and forth of tasks and silences, that something shifted in me. I thought survival was the same as living. Turns out it wasn't. The winter held on longer than most. Snow stacked high against the barn, wind carving it into sharp edges. But in that stillness, I found myself watching for the curve of Nayeli's mouth when she tried not to smile, for the way Tallulah's eyes brightened when she learned a new chore. I noticed how Nayeli always stood so her sister had the warmer seat, how Tallulah's laughter could pull the cold out of a room. One night, with the fire low and the air heavy with wood smoke, Nayeli caught me watching her mend the sleeve of my shirt. She didn't look away this time. "You are not like the men I have known," she said. It wasn't praise or judgment, just truth laid between us. "Neither are you like the women I have known," I said back. She gave a small, unreadable smile and went on stitching. By the time spring began to break the snow, I knew something I hadn't before. Some storms strip you bare, but others plant something in your soil you didn't know could grow. I'd taken them in thinking it was a kindness. But it turned out they had been the ones giving me shelter, in ways I'd only begun to understand. And if you ever find yourself in a winter like that, when the wind cuts and the world goes still, leave your door open. You never know what grace the wind might carry in.